So you will see the little prompt for the recording. As I mentioned before, if you don't want to be visible or audible, stay muted, which we ask you to do through the talks anyway. But when we get to the Q&A session, you can remain muted and keep your camera off. So welcome everyone to today's repository support webinar. My name is Joy Davidson. I'm with the DCC and the FAIR's FAIR project. And today we are going to hear the second part of a webinar on metadata exchange issues from Claudia Martens from B2FIND. Before we go into today's session, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the project. I'll remove this bar from the screen. So just a little bit about FAIR's FAIR, and I know some of you probably have been part of these webinars before, so apologies for having to hear this again. But for those of you who maybe haven't joined one of our webinars before, I thought it would just be useful to give you a bit of background on the project. So FAIR's FAIR is a Horizon 2020 funded project. We are quite a large project, 22 partners from across Europe. We've been running now since March 2019, and actually next Monday is our last official day of the project, so we're very close to the end. I think this is one of the final events we have for the project. The FAIR's FAIR project over the course of our existence has really put an emphasis on trying to foster the uptake of good practices in relation to making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, otherwise known as FAIR. So that's been the key driver for us. As part of our work, we recognize that repositories play a huge role in trying to make data fair. And as such, we have 3 work packages in FAIR's FAIR that have been targeting different repository support actions. The one I'm doing as part of work package 3, which is the FAIR data policy and practice work package, is this webinar series. And really what we're trying to do with these webinars is to give repositories a flavor of some of the FAIR enabling activities that they might want to consider and some examples of what others in the field are doing. A key aim for us with these repositories support series has been to try and reach those smaller repositories who maybe are struggling a little bit with resources and just want to know what they can start to do to be able to become more FAIR enabling. So hopefully we have some people in the audience today who are coming from that community and hopefully from other communities as well. So the specific aims for today's session, as I mentioned, this is the second of 2 repository support webinars that we've had from Claudia Martens from B2FIND. The first session that she gave us, which I think was back in October, we had so much to say that we thought we needed a follow-up to pick up on it. So the first session, Claudia had picked up on metadata exchange issues, the same topic as we're looking at today. The first webinar had been looking a lot more at metadata harvesting and integration of metadata and some of the challenges around that. Today's talk is looking a little bit more at the kind of findability of data and search functionality and trying to share some lessons learned from B2FIND around that. Claudia is going to give us an overview of some of the work they've been doing within B2FIND, and more importantly, sharing some of her experiences in working in running the service, some common challenges that she's experienced, and sharing a little bit of some of the existing approaches to harvesting metadata and mapping. She will then give us a little bit of a taster of some new functionality that has been introduced into the B2FIND service to improve the searchability and the findability of data. So we'll get a sneak preview there. But before we go into Claudia's talk, one of the things I would like to ask people to do is to go to menti.com and to enter code 61536849. And I'm going to stop sharing now, oops, and share another screen. Not working for some reason. Oh, here we go. Sorry about the delay. So if you can go to menti.com, enter the code 61536849. What I'd like to know is just who is in the room today. So if people can tell us, are you coming from a national repository, an institutional repository, domain-specific repository, maybe you're a metadata aggregator service or you're coming from other. And if you're one of those who is picking the other option, we'd love it if you can put in the chat, in the Zoom chat, just where you're coming from and give us a sense of who's joining us today. So it looks like most of the people are coming from the institutional repository side, but quite a lot of people coming from other. So I think we might have some researchers in the audience. I think Claudia mentioned she might have some colleagues joining. So good to see that we're getting some different people joining the webinars than the usual suspects. So I think we've got 27 out of the nearly 50 people in the room. So I'll give you just another second if you want to add your demographic information into the Menti. So it's getting quite close. So this one seems to have quite a lot of people coming from the other categories. So again, we'd love to hear more about who's in the room and where you're coming from. I'll leave this open so people can continue to add into it as you come in. The next question I wanted to ask, though, is whether you have experienced any specific challenges in making the data you hold findable. And this is primarily for those who are coming from the repository side. So yes, no, or other, and other. If you choose that one, we'd love to know what you want to say there. So quite a few people, one person has chosen other, so that's great. We're always glad to hear what you might have to say there. But it does look like quite a few people have had some challenges in making their data holdings findable, which is what we wouldn't expect, I think, because it is a challenging field. So a couple of people seem to have few problems. That's great. And we're always happy to hear if you've got advice that you can share. These webinars are meant to be kind of interactive, so please share any kind of tips that you want in the chat as well, if you've got examples of things that others might be able to benefit from. So I think clearly we've got a few people in the audience who have had difficulties. So what I would ask is, for those 11 who have said that they do have problems, if you maybe just want to use the free text and give us an example of some of the challenges you've faced. And we can see hopefully if some of those might get picked up in the session today. So if anybody wants to add in anything, please feel free to do so. I won't stay on it too long. If people are not wanting to share that, that's fine. I think we can leave this open, and if people do want to type anything into the Menti as we go through, we can try to pick up some of those challenges maybe in the question and answer later. So I think don't feel pressured to do it just now. I will stop sharing my screen so that, we've got choosing the best repository. I think that's coming maybe from one of the repository users perhaps, rather than a provider, but not sure. But that is true. Finding information on which metadata schemes to use and how to expose them. Yeah, I think that's true. There's a lot of information out there, and it can be quite confusing to know what is the right approach. I think one thing to mention, we did cover a little bit on the metadata schemes and integration in the previous webinar, and the slides and the recording for that are also available online. So if you want to take a look at that after today's session, that would be maybe useful as well. So not sure how to find, not sure how findable my data actually is, and what are the differences between the repositories. I think that's a really good point. Not sure how findable my data is. And I think Claudia will pick up on this in her talk. It's hard to get yourself into the shoes of somebody who's looking for data and what sorts of things they want to look for. And I think Claudia certainly will pick up on this in her talk. So I think that's a really great point, whoever added that. The astronomy IVOA registry as well integrated with B2FIND. That's great. How can this be made more findable in the EOS portal? I think that also is a really good point. We did have a webinar actually just last week on the potential use of DCAT as a catalog integration point, and that webinar might also be useful. So it looks like we've got some good stuff here about what is sufficient metadata that you can make findable even if the data can't. Very good point. Not all data can be openly accessible, but you would like to make sure that people can find out that it exists. So what would be sufficient metadata to make that record useful to whoever finds it? So I think, yeah, some definitely good stuff here. So I think at this point, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and by all means, feel free to continue adding to that if you have other things that we haven't covered yet. But very good points raised so far. And I think several of those will come up in Claudia's talk. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Claudia Martens from DKRZ and B2FIND, and she is going to give us some of the B2FIND experience and making their data holdings findable. So I will now hand over to you, Claudia.
Jawohl. Hi.
And please feel free to put questions and comments in the chat, and we will try to pick them up. We've got some time for questions after Claudia's talk. So over to you, Claudia.
Yeah, hi. This is the second part. Welcome you to Metadata Exchange Issues Part 2. I would like to add that Annalena, fortunately, so the other or maybe better part of B2FIND is within the chat. So if you have urgent questions, ask it there, because and for the rest, maybe wait until until the end of the presentation. Just to sum up, for the last time, we focused on harvesting and mapping. And here only as a summary, we describe what we are using, which methods to retrieve metadata, both let's say standard ways, but also community-specific ways. So when we harvest via REST APIs, we can get anything out. We do mapping using different standards. And I saw one question in the chat that how to find the best terms. Incredibly quick question, because that depends on what you use and whether that's sufficient or not. We support generic standards like Dublin Core data sites, OpenAir. Also specific ones like the ISO, that's the georeference data, and DDI, which is for social sciences originally. But we also do support community specific, and this is special, and this is a lot of work. And I believe this work is useful. Today, the focus is on discovery. So here we want to have a look at what search options you offer, which are useful, so how people may search within this portal. But of course, that relates back to the way you get the metadata integrated in the first instance. And so we start. When you click on b2find.eu.eu, you see a clear search interface. This is something like this, and then you enter any topic you're interested in. In this case, let's say foraminifera. This is single-cell organisms that live in salty water and seems to be quite important in bio and ecological research. Don't know exactly why, but I know a lot of data about them exist. When you click on the search button here, then you get a result page. And this result page here says nearly 10,000 for foraminifera, which is probably a bit too much. So you want to narrow down the results. And this you can do by using the facets. We currently have on the productive B2FIND 13 facets, which are listed here. So spatial, temporal, coverage, publication year, and so on. The point I have to say is that the temporal coverage is not really working on the productive B2FIND, which is why we have excluded it here in the image. So you don't see it, it's usually here. But we have it working on the new version of B2FIND, which will be published when we have finished everything, but I can show you a demo version today with a working temporal coverage. So you have 10,000 records, right, or roundabout, and then you use all these facets to narrow down your results. Let's say you want to search within the map because you're interested in foraminifera only in the, let's say, Baltic Sea. Then you use the map, get 188 records. You can then even narrow down even more using, I don't know, resource type or open access or even keywords maybe. And when you click on one link, which is displayed, one record, which is displayed on the search result page, you get the single result page, which includes all the information that is not shown on the overview page. That includes all the identifier we get, which are displayed as clickable links on the right side. So when there is a DOI, it will be displayed as DOI. I will come back to that later. What I want to mention is that we always display metadata access, as you see, and we are asked very often why. And the reason is actually that we want to have the link to the metadata themselves in case that what we show or make searchable is not good enough, so to say. Sometimes you have certain formats or standards, metadata standards, where a lot of more information is given than the information we may display, which is why we always include for each record the metadata access, so the originally harvested metadata. We also have information on the single result page, which is not in the overview, something like here, rights information, or even information about format size. Now, of course, any search portal relies on the information given. So what you need is to decide which metadata elements you want to make searchable. In the case of B2FIND, this is the now EU.core metadata schema. That's not really officially published, but is described and defined and has a namespace and an XSD, and I've put the link at the end. I've put all links at the end in one slide, so they are not here. That's how it looks like. Those of you familiar with generic metadata schemes will see that it looks pretty much like DataSite. This is a simple image, of course. We did not display all the relations, the attributions, the allowed values within the elements. But those are the metadata elements we do have in our scheme. So this is what we retrieve or what we can show, even when you retrieve more. It looks pretty much like DataSite. What is special is that we have specifically a spatial and a temporary coverage here. We have this metadata access, and then I think context and open access is something. DataSite has not as a specific element, but only as rights within the rights information. Today, I want to focus on 4 things that I believe are very important and give you a lot of examples what it means in practice to deal with different schemes, different standards, and one search portal. Those are always the identifier, it's the discipline, it's open access, and the temporary coverage, which, as I said, I would like to show you in a demo version. Let's start with the identifier. I showed this picture in the last webinar again, because it shows what the way we deal with persistency. What is persistence? It's a very old question. That the persistent identification of research data is crucial, is everyone agrees on that, but what it means in practice and in theory is not really clear. For search portals, it's important that you always link to something. So as we don't have the data, we have no data at all. We only have metadata. We need something for the identification of the resource where you can click on and then get access to the data, right? This is the concept of landing pages. Not everyone is convinced that's a good idea, but anyway, that's in reality the way it works right now. I want to hint to the fact that the usage of DOIs is something which is now quite common, but this is not really the case for a long time. So DOIs are coming, but more persistent identifier types as well. B2FIND was developed nearly 8 years ago right now, I think. And our approach was to say, okay, we take what we get. If this is no PID, we will display any URL we get. Of course, we do advise anyone to have persistent identifiers, but in reality, sometimes it's not possible to get some for many reasons. So it's better to have a link to the data, even when it is maybe not really persistent, I think. That means for B2FIND in practice that we have a kind of ranking. When we retrieve, when we harvest, when we get any citable PID, which is a DOI, we display this as DOI. When we have any other PID, we will display this as PID. Currently, it's mainly handles, but it's also ARCs. And from the IVOR people, we get zip codes. When we have no DOI, neither DOI nor PID, we take anything, any URN or any other, well, there are not so many others, but we take anything we get and display this as source. And when we retrieve all, we display all. We have no exclusive stuff. This is an overview of the types of identifier allowed across different generic schemes. Where I want to hint is that DOI, or no, the other way around, DataCite was built to create DOIs. So the schema from DataCite is made for the registration of DOIs, which means that the only allowed identifier type is a DOI. Nonetheless, if you want to use DataCite as an exchange format or schema, you can, and you have no DOIs, even when you have no DOIs, you can just put in your identifier as alternate identifier and use it anyway, right? Exactly that point, that there is the restriction of the identifier type of DOI forced, or not really forced, but brought OpenAIRE to the point to say, okay, we allow more. So other identifier types as well. And as you see, U.Core allows everything. But actually, in reality, we usually have only DOIs, handles, pools, owns, and words. Yeah, this is, again, the point here is, even when you can misuse any metadata schema if there is a need to do, and a lot of people do. Discipline. Oh yeah, that's an interesting story. We started again 8 years ago nearly with a vocabulary that defined different scientific disciplines. And that was a Wikipedia list for branches of science at that time, which is different of the branches of science today, which is of course not really satisfying. So we evaluated whether there are other existing classifications. Because we believe that discipline is an important element for an interdisciplinary research portal. What we find out is that they are not really usable, the ones we found, either because they are too formal. This is certainly true for the classifications coming from the library and information science, because well, they are old and not really represent current status of research. The DDC is Dewey Decimal Classification, about 100 years old, and the UDC is the Universal Decimal Classification, even older. And as you see here, so the 000 computer science and information was added only a few years ago, and the basic 000 was general books. And then you have philosophy and psychology, and there is no biology, no physics, no natural sciences in general. So to sum up, it's just outdated, or yeah, well, old. It's a grown structure, and it has been important for, let's say, I don't know, a few hundred years at least, but even longer. But it's in no way good to represent current status of research area, scientific disciplines. The other problem was with classifications we found, for instance, the FOS, which is the fields of science from the OECD. That, as you see on the first level, they have natural sciences, engineering and technology, medical health sciences, and then agricultural sciences. And then social sciences, humanities. So agricultural sciences in no way is on the first level equal to natural sciences and social sciences. But of course, it represents what the OECD is doing, namely funding different fields of science. I don't know, but a lot of money goes to the whole agricultural sector, which is why it is displayed here. But this is not this is coming from a political perspective, but it's not coming from a science perspective. So even within all the different scientific areas, we have an immense amount of vocabularies. Some of them very specific, some are mappable, some are not, but there is no real good generic classification for research disciplines or research areas. Over the years, there have been several projects, combined projects. Some of them we took part that tried to develop something that is reusable. But they failed mainly due to the point that when you want to develop something that is reusable, you have to anyhow make sure that it is maintained. And this is very difficult, namely with funding. So our current status, what we do for our facet discipline, for our metadata element discipline. We use a formal classification from the German National Funding Agency, which was modified to our needs because as it is a national funding agency, it represents the national funding system, which includes medieval German literature and then European and American literature and no other literature. It is of course not fitting at all. So we took that classification as a foundation and modified it to our actually practical needs. So the changes we did very often up to the requests of our communities. So we gave them the classification, said, do you see your research area here? Does it fit? Does it not fit? And if it does not fit, do you have a specific entry you wanna have added? So this is the foundation for the script we have, which is taking all the information from the subjects or keywords we get, and then it looks whether there is a fitting, and when it fits up to, I think, 90%, then it puts the record into this discipline. When it does not fit, then there is no value given. Of course, we can always have flexible or no fixed coded mappings, but in a flexible way. So for instance, Blue Cloud is clearly marine sciences. So we fixed coded all records from Blue Cloud are into the scientific discipline marine science. We did a lot of interesting stuff with the disciplines, for instance, integrating the astrothesaurus. But this is what I described in the webinar before, so I won't do it now. Future work, well, yes. Either we find a classification that does offer what we need, then we would use it in B2FIND, but also, of course, within the other EU services. Or we have to develop something that is reusable and sustainable. There are some general points to make about the questions of disciplines or research areas. First of all, there are different ways to build a structure or to build concepts. You can have a classification which defines clearly dependencies. So you have one record given into one thing and only one thing, and not really multiple options. The reason is that the concept of classification is that you can classify something into one point entry. So the concept of thesauri is different. Thesauri rely on having relations to other terms. Then you have ontologies, which do the same, but in a more complex way, but which are made for a certain kind of data or metadata, which are linked data. And then you have closed vocabularies, which you can build in any way you want, right? We have our experience is that it is very difficult to classify really specific records. And this is true for two reasons. The one is that when you have a method where you do something, the result could be used in many disciplines. So this example here of you make a picture of the structure of a protein that is somewhere in any color in an Asian painting, but it could be used, the result of that, right, could be used in anything that is related to the structure of this protein, right? And the other reason why it is not really easy to deal with topic is that the boundaries from one discipline to the other are not clearly defined. And I mean, I'm sure they can't. So where do you say this discipline stops here and the next discipline starts there? And my thinking is that the deeper you dive into, so the more concrete you go, the deepest level you find, the more it could be related to any general or to more general top level entries. What I want to say with this is that it's not really easy. If you want to do something like that, it should be in a way that it's, again, sustainable, reusable. You should put some thinking in it. Right, open access, next point. This is a very good example for how user needs change, because this demand of knowing whether a data set is open or not could clearly rise. This is an image of the current B2FIND on the productive machine. And as you see, we have nearly 1.4 billion records. I always mix it up with this English numbers, which are open access true. But of course, the question is, what is open? I have no clear answer here. I have a lot of examples where we don't know what open means. For instance, we have one community that describes within their rights that this data is for scientific use only. What is scientific use? Only. Is it open now? Right? And this happens very often. So our practical approach right now is that what we do is that we have a Boolean operator. We say the default for all records is true if it is not specified differently. Usually we get any rights information within the metadata elements rights, no matter from which, nearly all standards we have something like rights or licenses. And then we have a kind of stop word list. So when we find any entry like closed, embargoed, restricted, closed, within the rights, then we will map this record onto false. I'm not sure this is the right way to go. Maybe we could even turn it around and say, no, we make all data records as default closed, right? And only make them open. I don't know. This is currently the way we are doing it. Maybe there are better ways, I don't know. Let us know if you have splendid ideas. Coming back, or not coming back, but coming now to the temporary coverage, which is, as I said, not working on the productive B2FIND, but which is hopefully working here now. Yippee! That's the foundation for the next B2FIND version. And if you, no. I just want to show you that we have only 4 communities here because it is a test machine. It is not open to the public. It's an internal stuff. If you search for climate, for instance, and then you want to narrow down and say you want to have only something within, I don't know, 18th, 19th century, maybe before World War II, then you find one data set for the climate record in the city. That's Berlin, published by Pangea and Christopher Caro and others. And here you see that the temporal coverage has a begin and an end date. You could continue to search, but I will go back to the presentation. So this temporal coverage is something valuable, I believe, because more and more data are having those coverage elements. Of course, this is certainly true for any time series, but it's also for, it's an option to define a specific period. What are you in which you are looking? Now, the main question here is, of course, how do we get the information what the temporary coverage is? And the answer is in multiple ways. We may get the information with ISO standards and data side, and the example here is Pangea, because Pangea, best data publisher ever, really, they are splendid. They do expose their metadata all based with various standards. In ISO 19115, 19139, so this is the Inspire directive, or the foundation for that. I don't like the standard, I have to say. It's very old-fashioned, outdated, and complicated, but it includes a time period which you can enter, right? The same record here, which is the one I just showed you, is transferred the information in data side using the date type collected. That's possible in dataside 4. I'm not sure whether it's possible in the older dataside versions, schema versions. The point is that, I don't know, even if you use an older schema, you can, if you don't validate it, you could probably just do it. That's the point with standards. What they want you to do and what you do is not always congruent. So with ISO and with dataside, we get the information out. Now, a community specific. Here the example is Blue Cloud, which we are harvesting via their JSON API. And then when we do a direct integration of a specific community, we always make a specific mapping, of course. And as long as the information is given, we can always map it. Here it is pretty easy. So that's a JSON record, it has 2 values. And we just tell our script, okay, if you find something, some value in temporal extent begin, please put this onto our temporal coverage begin date. And the same for end. So easygoing. DDI is the standard for social sciences. In principle, it allows to display temporal coverage. For instance, with time period, start and end date. We have integrated Chester. We have integrated a test version of Chester data catalog. There is no information in about time periods, but I think this is due to us or maybe to them, I don't know, but anyway, it's only a test ingestion. So in theory or in principle, it works with DDI, but I can't show you a practical example here. What I can show you is an example for something that is not good to use, which is unfortunately Dublin Core. Dublin Core is, pretty old, really old, developed by in the aftermath of a meeting from librarians in Dublin, Ohio. That's why it's called Dublin Core. Nearly 40 years ago, I think. No, quite old. The metadata elements in Dublin Core now have an element that is called coverage, but this is not specified. So you could use it for geo information as well as for plain text or even temporal information. And that means that it may be quite messy, which looks on the machine like this. So this is a very long description of the record. Then you have a lot of keywords, and then you have here the information, which is in Dublin Core. It is now mapped to spatial coverage because the other records only have, when they have information, it's a word like Germany or Norway or any other country. And here, this mix up from you have a term for a place, for a country in this case, and you have time ranges which you can't clearly get out. What we could do is that we write a script that says, okay, if you find something in the element coverage that includes numbers, put them out. But even then, we don't know what these numbers refer to. So are those multiple records, or is this all different times related to the one record? So as you see, it's not that easy to deal with. We're nearly finished. We come to our lessons learned. Yeah, main thing is, of course, search interfaces change as user needs change. When we started, so nearly 10 years ago, the public meaning, let's say, was more anything that is done within the web and related to search must be as plain as possible. So clear, no, not too much information, just precise and clean. That changed. Now you want to have a lot of information. So again, or you want to have display only important information and then ask what is important, right? And where's the equilibrium? That's the never-ending story. How many metadata elements are necessary to have a useful search? How many are too much? So that's an ongoing discussion, which relates, of course, to the same question. When you have the elements, which do you display as facets? How many facets are useful? Experiences from our side is the first one, very important, is that you have different needs for different research areas. For all Earth environmental research, you have georeference data that rely on geocoordinates. That's crucial for them. It's not really crucial for medical data. Another example is funding reference. Funding reference, so information about funding is included in our schema in the EU.core. But I have refused to make it a facet for 6 years because I could never imagine that a researcher is really looking for funding information. I thought that's something only funder or politics or policy people are looking for, but never ever someone who's really looking for data. But then we get several requests from people who were searching for data from a specific project funded by, I forgot, I think it was DFG, right? So, should we include funding reference as a facet? I'm still not sure, but I mean, if people ask for it. Another example is the IVOA people, so International Virtual Observatory Alliance. They have splendid data as well. They have coordinates on Sky. I always wanted to include them, which is impossible. Coordinates on Sky, even if they are quite far away. I mean, how do you show this on a map that is two-dimensional? It's impossible. And even the question then, okay, wouldn't it be cool to have a map from the universe? Yeah, it would be cool, but would it help any people searching for medical data? Probably not. So again, where's the equilibrium? Where's the point where how many metadata you need and for what? There is no clear answer. As search interfaces change and user needs, of course, metadata standards evolve over time. And that means continuous development. So it's nothing that stops. What we do is that we enable the integration of communities using standards, but also those who have no standard. And that is a valuable work in my eyes. And of course, it is good in a way that you have more information and then you have a better precision and recall. It is bad in a way, you could argue, that it is not done by machines. It is not done automatically, it is done by humans. Experiences is even when standards are used, they may be misused. Even you have clearly defined standards like data site, but then you can put an attribution type and someone is using this in a different way than it should be used. It happens. It happens pretty often. And to get this done, then to get the information out, nonetheless, you need to talk to people or anyhow communicate with them, and that requires effort. So we are coming to the questions. Let machines do the work for us, right? So nice try. I don't think it's possible in the next years, even not with Google. So we have some examples where records, research data records are findable in Google only via B2FIND, because Google is crawling us constantly. And it seems that what we do, so integrate repos which are not integrated otherwise, and expose our metadata, that enables Google to find records which are not offered otherwise. So let's say without us, Google wouldn't be that good. But then Google is for web information, right? So what you do when you want to be findable in Google is you put all the small informations within the websites, within the HTML probably, or you can even use JSON. So it doesn't matter what you use, but there are different techniques too. But what it is mainly for search engine optimization. Search engine optimization does not necessarily mean that you see more data. It means that the data you already see can be found by Google. But those who don't expose their data, they are not found at all. So search engine optimization is one thing, but I don't think it's a sufficient one. And the reason is that in reality, most data are not exposed at all. This is certainly not true for communities that are used to work with huge amount of data. For instance, again, the astrophysics, they do incredible stuff with data, and they are incredibly collaborative for 20 years now. The same is valid for the climate, not climate, but climate modeling community. At least the whole spirit is to do the research together collectively, and therefore all data must be open, must be replaced. How's it called? And must be published, must be maintained, and so on and so on. And therefore, I would like to mention that the first DOI ever given was given for a record from the VDCC. But this is only some communities. This is certainly not true if you have, for instance, some biology institute in, I don't know, northern France, and then they are collecting their data on the beach on Belgium. And the data then is lying on the institutional computer, and no one wants to share this data because this person collected it himself or herself. And those data are a lot of data. So it depends pretty much on the, let's say, tradition within the community. Even those communities who do expose metadata do it in different ways. And making data fair is a good way. But the whole fair stuff, well, first it only started, and the other point is someone has to do the work, right? If you want to make your data fair and you want to expose it in a specific way, and you want to use a generic schema, someone has to sit there and enable all this stuff, and then maintain all this stuff, and then adapt a new version of the schema that is going. So this is work, and it is not done automatically. What we do in this whole process, and this is my last point, we are an entry point for research data. We never ever replace any community-specific or thematic search portals, but we show what is there across disciplines, and that is, in my opinion, valuable. We have a very flexible way to do the mapping, and we enable very much, or a lot of ways to integrate information. We are not only a metadata aggregator, but also a metadata curator. And so that makes our work, so the map files themselves for each community, and we are about, I think, over 50 right now, each of them being very specific, they are all openly accessible. Of course, everything on B2FIND is in GitHub. We would like to make them reusable by others. There are some next big EU-funded projects, maybe that will be part of it. And within the whole process to do this mapping, we always experience that consulting and advice is extremely important, really. And therefore you have to communicate, and this is effort, but necessary. And with that, I'm finished. I'm a bit over the time, I guess.
No, that's great. Thank you very much, Claudia. I think it's always great to have you and Annalena come along, because I think you give a really good example of how you work within the kind of higher level good practice, but you do reality checks and make sure that what you're doing meets your community needs. So you're practical, and you're trying to make sure that what you do is something that is meeting the needs of your users. So I think it's always great to hear that. There have been a couple of questions in the chat, and I know Annalena's been answering them as we go along, but I thought it might be worth just revisiting them just in case people aren't following the chat.
Yeah.
So the first question, and I don't know if it's either you or Annalena who wants to pick it up, was just about the main considerations you had for choosing Core over DataCite. And I know Annalena has provided an answer in the chat, but I just thought it might be worth picking up again for others.
The short answer is that because we believe that the elements we have are valuable for finding research data, and this is temporal and spatial coverage. So spatial coverage was out of discussion. I mean, DataCite allows now to have it, but not from the beginning in an easy way. We did it from the beginning in an easy way because we come from a geo community. So the same is valid for the temporal. And then we have the discipline, and the bit is, I mean, EUDAT Core is developed for transferring information across EUDAT services. So why should we use a standard which is not fitting our purposes? That's always the point. I'm absolutely convinced that a lot of metadata standards are absolutely useful within their communities. It's not, there will never be one generic, one fits all solution, and it is not needed that there is one fits all. The point is that different metadata schemas must be able to talk to each other. And that is not that easy, and not really yet done by machines.
Yeah, I mean, I thought
the question.
Yeah, I think so. If anybody wants clarification, that's fine. But I think, you know, you're right that it's all about understanding what's the right standard for you. There are lots of standards out there, but you want to make sure that whatever you use is suitable for your community. There are another couple of questions that I'll pick up then. There was a question asking if you considered EuroSci-VOC, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, for classifying the scientific domain. It's based on OECD, but it is maintained by the European Union, and they import terms from EU-funded projects. I'm not sure if that's something that either of you have looked at before.
What was the question?
Oh, sorry, it was if you have looked at EuroSci-VOC as a classifying for the scientific domain?
No, no, we didn't, but we should maybe.
Okay, it's good if we can point out new things as well. So that's what we like to see, is people putting things into the chat that might be useful.
For sure.
Back to. That's great. I know there was a bit of discussion. Oh, okay. There was a bit of discussion on the open access. I don't know if you wanted to pick up on that, Annalena or Claudia.
Yeah, we had a discussion in the chat with Carsten Heuer-Klick, who provided valuable input. He asked or he advised that we should turn the open access default setting around to false, because his argument was that in copyright law, the default value is closed for data sets. Data is only open if it has an open license. So he said you probably need to turn it around, and I answered him that I would disagree, because from B2FIND we come from the search perspective, from the findability perspective. And for us, while the open access facet is not meant to do a legal statement that this data set is absolutely open, 100% green, reusable, gold standard open. It is just a hint for our users that the data set is openly accessible. Even if it may not be reused, like Claudia said in the example with the for scientific use only, you can still access it. You can, as a user searching for data, you can still get the information. And then if needed, sometimes you have to contact the researcher who owns the data set or something and ask if you can reuse it. But you can still find it in the first place. If we would turn it around and make no, it's closed, the default, people who search for data sets would not consider those probably. They would expect to end up in front of a wall somehow.
Yeah, I guess it's that balance. So you'd rather people can find out that the data exists, and then follow up if there's ambiguity over how accessible it is, rather than saying, we're not even going to show it to you.
Yes.
Because okay.
This is our approach, very practical and by no way perfect.
But I think that's the real life kind of approach, and it's what people want. So people can, if they're interested and think it's useful, then follow up, but they at least know it's there. Yeah, that's great. There was another question about whether
B2FIND, I think.
Sorry?
Was there but he lowered it again.
If anybody had, I don't see the hand now, but if anybody did raise their hand.
I'll put it back up again then.
Oh, yeah, please go ahead then. Feel free to unmute.
I don't know if you can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Good. So I was going to chime in with, because this discussion actually reminded me of discussions that happen in other spheres that I've sort of experienced, been part of. I think first off, I think there's two things here. There's the default, as if you don't know any better, do you assume that it's open or not? I think I would go with Carsten saying that it should be false if you don't know, because if you don't know, you don't know, and copyright law says that it's closed if you don't know otherwise. In terms of facet searching, I think it's perfectly reasonable to leave that open, except show all data that you know about. But the other thing was more a perspective thing. So this is something that reminds me of discussions that have happened many years ago within the open source software development community. And over time, people developed licenses that described what you're allowed to do with the software. And initially there was a large number of these things, and they kind of over time they coalesced down to a fewer number of these things that then became well defined. People used them, and there was sort of a gravitational attraction thing here, where if what you wanted to do was similar to one of the existing ones, you would just use one of the existing ones rather than writing your own license, because that's a lot easier for everyone. So over time, this kind of like gravitational collapse, this kind of condensed down to just a few options that were available, and then organizations then sort of in effect had profiles. So the open source community had said these set of licenses we consider open source, these other ones aren't. Then the Free Software Foundation had another list of ones that they considered free, another one that the other ones aren't, and the Debian project had another set of lists of these ones are free. So different people can categorize them in different ways. So that happened in the open source the programming, the computing environment. A similar process then happened with Creative Works, and this is the CC, Creative Commons licensing, that developed. And this took several iterations before it became kind of well established and covered everything. And I'm wondering, this is just a kind of a off the cuff remark, but I'm wondering whether we're in a similar situation with data sets. There are different aspects of different people consider open or free, reuse being an important one, which actually mirrors what happens in the Creative Commons licensing. Reuse is actually an important aspect of those. So there's a sort of a question in my mind whether there's a discussion to be had here within stakeholders that are providing data sets, publishing them, what aspects people want and how to represent that easily so that people can then tag their data set so it then becomes easily identifiable what the intended use is. And that would allow people to search much more easily to say, well, I don't care about data reuse. What I care about is this. Therefore, I care about my immediate use. And then services like B2FIND can then narrow down quite quickly and easily on the data sets that are available to support that particular scientific use case. So that was it really. Just
yeah, no, I think the licensing issue keeps coming up. We do data stewardship training courses in FAIRSPHERE, and the licensing and copyright are one of the areas that data stewards feel uncomfortable and they're not entirely confident about giving advice. And we know from other surveys like the open state of open data that licensing and copyright are a key problem for researchers as well. So I think you're right. I think there's a lot of work still to be done in trying to get this right within the community and get people familiar with using things like the Creative Commons license and being clear about what it is they want people to do and not to do. I guess there is that tension then for services like B2FIND and others to kind of take a risk-based approach as to how you make things available, whether you put the emphasis on just trying to make things visible and trust that people will follow up and do their homework on what's allowable or not. So I guess that's maybe a question for you is how you balance that approach in B2FIND.
Yes, if I may answer that. Yes, we are also a little bit on the safer side because B2FIND only deals with metadata. We have no business assigning labels to the actual data. And we also make clear in our user guidelines that citations or reuse or anything like that will always have to be verified at the source. Yeah. So we are really just about making things findable and
that's pretty fun, I mean, you do something which is not evil.
Yeah, I think that's great. And I think it's that kind of being really clear on what you are doing and what you're kind of your risks are fairly low then if you're just pointing to stuff. So I think that's great. I'm aware of the time. We're a little bit over time. I know that it's great to see that people have had questions. I would say please feel free to continue writing questions in. I'm sure anything that we didn't have a chance to talk to during the webinar, if you want to get in touch with me, I'd be happy to pass the questions on to Claudia and Annalena afterwards. But for now, I think I'm just going to maybe wrap up just so that we can let people move on to their next set of meetings or lunch or whatever they're moving on to. But just for me, I have a couple of summing up points to say. So thank you again to Claudia and to Annalena for coming along today and giving us another really useful, I think, and real kind of practical description of work on trying to make metadata findable and usable. So I think you've given us all lots to think about. A couple of points I've picked up from your talk is that enabling discovery is not, you don't do it once and then forget about it. It means constantly looking at the landscape and seeing what's happening, adapting your existing approaches, or even possibly moving to new approaches. And that will have implications for your service and in continuous development of the service. I like the point that you made about the fact that search interfaces need to be kind of evolving over time to meet the needs of your user communities. So that kind of implies that you need to have a flexible approach to allowing search within your service, but also that you have to have that communication with your community so that you know what they need. And that, I think, as you've mentioned several times, is not something that's easy to do. It takes time and effort, and we need to be able to find a way to resource that really crucial part of keeping the communication lines open between the service providers, the repositories, and the people who are actually using the data and depositing the data. So I think this whole notion of we can't just rely on automation for everything. The manual process is still going to be key, and that we all have a role to play, and that real focus on communication is something I've really taken away. So I hope everybody has found something useful today that you can hopefully take back and apply in your own day-to-day services. And as I mentioned, if we didn't get a chance to answer your questions, I will share them with Annalena and Claudia, and feel free to get in touch if you have any other questions. So thank you to all of you for joining us today, and thank you to Claudia and Annalena for another great overview of the work you're doing with B2FIND. And thank you to Rita in the background for keeping everything running so smoothly. And we wish you all another good day, and thanks again for everything.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's great. I think we can stop the recording.